as you have done in the past, you will stand shoulder to shoulder and face to face, supporting that leader of our nation who is daily tortured by willful misrepresentations. That world leader who would gladly give all that he has, even his life, if called upon, so that other men might live in peace and freedom. Gentlemen, I present to you the President of the United States.
Mr. Tobin, I should say Dan. I always have. Ladies and gentlemen, I am very much touched. And I'm very happy in your applause and very happy at the informality of this dinner with old friends of mine. This is not the first time that we have met together on this basis. And I am particularly happy that this national campaign opens in your presence, as it did 4 years ago. And I don't mind mentioning the fact that Dan Tobin and I are just a little bit superstitious. Well, here we are. Here we are again after 4 years, and what years they have been. You know, I am actually 4 years older, which is a fact that seems to annoy some people. In fact, in the mathematical field, there are millions of Americans who are more than 11 years older than when we started in to clear up the mess that was dumped into our laps in 1933. That certain people who make it a practice to depreciate the accomplishments of labor, who even attack labor as unpatriotic, they keep this business up, usually for 3 years and 6 months in a row. But then, for some strange reason, they change their tune every 4 years, just before Election Day. When votes are at stake, they suddenly discover that they really love labor. And that they are anxious to protect labor from its old friends. I got quite a laugh, for example, and I'm sure that you did, when I read this plank in the Republican platform adopted at their National Convention last July. The Republican Party accepts the purposes of the National Labor Relations Act, the Wage and Hour Act, the Social Security Act, and all other federal statutes designed to promote and protect the welfare of American working men and women, and we promise a fair and just administration of those laws. You know, many of the Republican leaders and congressmen and candidates who shouted enthusiastic approval of that plank in that convention hall would not even recognize these progressive laws if they met them in broad daylight. Indeed, they have personally spent years of effort and energy and much money in fighting every one of those laws in the Congress and in the press and in the courts ever since this administration began to advocate them and enact them into legislation. This is a fair example of their insincerity and of their inconsistency. The whole purpose of Republican oratory these days seems to be to switch labels. The object is to persuade the American people that the Democratic Party was responsible for the 1929 crash and the Depression, and that the Republican Party was responsible for all social progress under the New Deal. Now, imitation may be the sincerest form of flattery, but I am afraid that in this case it is the most obvious common or garden variety of fraud. Of course, it's perfectly true that there are enlightened, liberal elements in the Republican Party. And they have fought hard and honorably to bring the party up to date and to get it in step with the forward march of American progress. But these liberal elements were not able to drive the old guard Republicans from their entrenched positions. Can the old guard pass itself off as the New Deal? I think not. We've seen many marvelous stunts in the circus, but no performing elephant could turn a handspring without falling flat on its back. I need not recount to you the centuries of history that have been crowded into these 4 years since I saw you last. There were some in the Congress and out who raised their voices against our preparations for defense before and after 1939, objected to them, raised their voices against them as hysterical warmongering, who cried out against our help to the Allies as provocative and dangerous. We remember those voices. They would like to have us forget them now. But in 1940 and 1949, seems a long time ago, they were loud voices. Happily, they were in the minority. And fortunately for ourselves and for the world, they could not stop America. There are some politicians who kept their heads buried in the sand while the storms of Europe and Asia were headed our way, who said that the Lend-Lease Bill would bring an end, and I'm quoting, to free government in the United States, and who said, and I'm quoting, "Only hysteria entertains the idea that Germany, Italy, or Japan contemplate war on us." These men, these very men, are now asking the American people to entrust to them the conduct of our foreign policy and our military policy. What the Republican leaders are now saying, in effect, is this: "Oh, just forget what we used to say. We've changed our minds now. We've been reading the public opinion polls about these things. And now we know what the American people want. And they say, don't leave the task of making the peace to those old men who first urged it and who have laid already the foundations for it, and who have had to fight all of us inch by inch during the last 5 years to do it. Why? Just turn it all over to us. We'll do it so skillfully that we won't lose a single isolationist vote or a single isolationist campaign contribution." I think there's one thing that you know. I am too old for that. I cannot talk out of both sides of my mouth at the same time. The government of the United States welcomes all sincere supporters of the cause of effective world collaboration in the making of a lasting peace. Millions of Republicans all over the nation are with us and have been with us in our unshakable determination to build the solid structure of peace. And they too will resent this campaign talk by those who first woke up to the facts of international life a few short months ago, when they began to study the polls of public opinion. Those who today have the military responsibility for waging this war in all parts of the globe are not helped by the statements of men who, without responsibility and without the knowledge of the facts, lecture the chiefs of staff of the United States as to the best means of dividing our armed forces and our military resources between the Atlantic and the Pacific, between the Army and the Navy, and among the commanding generals of the different theaters of war. And I may say that those commanding generals are making good in a big way. When I addressed you 4 years ago, I said this. I said, I know that America will never be disappointed in its expectation that labor will always continue to do its share of the job we now face, and do it patriotically and effectively and unselfishly. Today, we know that America has not been disappointed. In his order of the day, when the Allied armies first landed in Normandy 2 months ago, General Eisenhower said, our home fronts have given us overwhelming superiority in weapons and munitions of war. country knows that there's a breed of cats, luckily not too numerous, called labor baiters. I know that those labor baiters among the opposition who are there, but who, instead of calling attention to the achievements of labor in this war, prefer to pick on the occasional strikes that have occurred, strikes that have been condemned by every responsible national labor leader. I ought to say parenthetically, all but one. And that one labor leader, incidentally, is not conspicuous among my supporters. Labor baiters forget that at our peak, American labor and management have turned out airplanes at the rate of 109,000 a year. Tanks, 57,000 a year. Combat vessels, 573 a year. Landing vessels to get the troops ashore, 51,000 a year. Cargo ships, 19 million tons a year. And Henry Kaiser's here tonight, I'm glad to say. And small arms ammunition, oh, I can't understand it. Don't believe you can either. 23 billion rounds a year. But a strike is news and generally appears in shrieking headlines. And of course, they say labor is always to blame. The fact is that since Pearl Harbor, only 0.1% of man-hours have been lost by strikes. Can you beat that? But, you know, even those candidates who burst out in election year affection for social legislation and for labor in general still think that you ought to be good boys and stay out of politics. And above all, they hate to see any working man or woman contribute a dollar bill to any wicked political party. Of course, it's all right for large financiers and industrialists and monopolists to contribute tens of thousands of dollars. But their solicitude for that dollar which the men and women in the ranks of labor contribute is always very touching. They are, of course, perfectly willing to let you vote unless you happen to be a soldier or a sailor overseas or a merchant seaman carrying the munitions of war. In that case, they've made it pretty hard for you to vote at all. For there are some political candidates who think that they may have a chance of election if only the total vote is small enough. And while I'm on the subject of voting, let me urge every American citizen, man and woman, to use your sacred privilege of voting. no matter which candidate you expect to support. Our millions of soldiers and sailors and merchant seamen have been handicapped or prevented from voting by those politicians, and those candidates who think that they stand to lose by such votes. You here at home have the freedom of the ballot, irrespective of party. You should register and vote this November. I think that is a matter of plain good citizenship. Words come easily, but they do not change the record. You are, most of you, old enough to remember what things were like for labor in 1932. You remember the closed banks and the breadlines and the starvation wages, the foreclosures of homes and farms, and the bankruptcies of business, the Hoovervilles, and the young men and women of the nation facing a hopeless, jobless future, the closed factories and mines and mills, the ruined and abandoned farms, the stalled railroads, the empty docks, the blank despair of a whole nation, and the utter impotence of the federal government. You remember the long, hard road with its gains and its setbacks, which we have traveled together ever since those days. Now, there are some politicians, of course, who do not remember that far back. And there are some who remember but find it convenient to forget. No, the record is not to be washed away that easily. The opposition in this year has already imported into this campaign a very interesting thing because it's fun. They have imported the propaganda technique invented by the dictators abroad. Remember, a number of years ago, there was a book, Mein Kampf, written by Hitler himself. The technique was all set out in Hitler's book, and it was copied by the aggressors of Italy and Japan. According to that technique, you should never use a small falsehood, always a big one, for its very fantastic nature would make it more credible. If only you keep repeating it over and over and over again. Well, let's take some simple illustrations that come to mind. For example, although I rubbed my eyes when I read it, we have been told that it was not a Republican depression, but a Democratic depression from which this nation was saved in 1933. That this administration, this one, today, is responsible for all the suffering and misery that the history books and the American people have always thought had been brought about during the 12 ill-fated years when the Republican Party was in power. Now, there's an old and somewhat lugubrious adage which says, never speak of a rope in the house of a man who's been hanged. In the same way, if I were a Republican leader speaking to a mixed audience, the last word in the whole dictionary that I would think of using is that word depression. You know, they pop up all the time. For another example, I learned much to my amazement that the policy of this administration was to keep men in the Army when the war is over because there might be no jobs for them in civil life. Well, the very day that this fantastic charge was first made, a formal plan for the method of speedy discharge from the Army had already been announced by the War Department, a plan based on the wishes of the soldiers themselves. This callous and brazen falsehood about demobilization was, of course, a very simple thing. It was an effort to stimulate fear among American mothers and wives and sweethearts. And incidentally, it was hardly calculated to boast the morale of our soldiers and sailors and airmen who are fighting our battles all over the world. But perhaps the most ridiculous of these campaign falsifications is the one that this administration failed to prepare for the war that was coming. I doubt whether even Goebbels would have tried that one. For even he would never have dared hope that the voters of America had already forgotten that many of the Republican leaders in the Congress and outside the Congress tried to thwart and block nearly every attempt that this administration made to warn our people and arm our nation. Some of them called our 50,000 airplane program fantastic. Many of those very same leaders who fought every defense measure that we proposed are still in control of the Republican Party. Look at the names. Were in control of its National Convention in Chicago and would be in control of the machinery of the Congress and of the Republican Party in the event of a Republican victory this fall. These Republican leaders have not been content with attacks on me, or on my wife, or on my sons. No, not content with that. They now include my little dog, Sally. Well, of course, I don't resent attacks, and my family don't resent attacks, but Fala does resent it. You know, Fala's Scotch. And being a Scotty, as soon as he learned that the Republican fiction writers in Congress and out had concocted a story that I'd left him behind on an Aleutian island and had sent a destroyer back to find him at a cost to the taxpayers of $2 or $3 or $8 or $20 million, his Scotch soul was furious. He has not been the same dog since. I am accustomed to hearing malicious falsehoods about myself, such as that old worm-eaten chestnut that I have represented myself as indispensable. But I think I have a right to resent, to object to libelous statements about my dog. I think we all recognize the old technique. The people of this country know the past too well to be deceived into forgetting. Too much is at stake to forget. There are tasks ahead of us which we must now complete with the same will, the same skill and intelligence and devotion that have already led us so far along the road to victory. There is no task of finishing victoriously this most terrible of all wars as speedily as possible and with the least cost in lives. There is the task of setting up international machinery to assure that peace, once established, will not again be broken. And there is the task that we face here at home, the task of reconverting our economy for the purposes of war, from the purposes of war to the purposes of peace. These peace-building tasks were faced once before, nearly a generation ago. They were botched, B-O-T-C-H-E-D. They were botched by a Republican administration. That must not happen this time. We will not let it happen this time. Unfortunately, we do not begin from scratch. Much has been done. Much more is underway. The fruits of victory this time will not be apples sold on street corners. Many months ago, the administration set up necessary machinery for an orderly peacetime demobilization. The Congress has passed much more legislation, continuing the agencies needed for demobilization, with additional powers to carry out their functions. I know that the American people, business and labor and agriculture, have the same will, basic will, to do for peace what they have done for war. And I know that they can sustain a national income that will assure full production and full employment under our democratic system of private enterprise, with government encouragement and aid whenever and wherever that is necessary. The keynote, back of all this literature that we read, the keynote of all that we propose to do in reconversion can be found in the one word, job. We shall lease or dispose of our government-owned plants and facilities and our surplus war property and land on the basis of how they can be best operated by private enterprise to give jobs to the greatest number. We shall follow a wage policy that will sustain the purchasing power of labor, for that means more production and more jobs. You and I know that the present policies on wages and prices were conceived to serve the needs of the great masses of the people. They stopped inflation. They kept prices on a relatively stable level. Through the demobilization period, policies will be carried out with the same objective in mind, to serve the needs of the great masses of the people. This is not the time in which men can be forgotten as they were in the Republican catastrophe that we inherited, the returning soldiers, the workers by their machines, the farmers in the fields, the miners, the men and women in offices and shops, do not intend to be forgotten. No, they know that they are not surplus, because they know that they are American. We must set targets and objectives for the future which will seem impossible, like the airplane, to those who live in and are weighted down by the dead past. And for months and today and in the future, we are organizing and will continue to put forth the logistics of the peace, just as Marshall and King and Arnold, MacArthur, Eisenhower, and Nimitz are organizing the logistics of this war. I think that the victory of the American people and their allies in this war will be far more than a victory against fascism and reaction and the dead hand of despotism of the past. The victory of the American people and their allies in this war will be a victory for democracy. It will constitute such an affirmation of the strength and power and vitality of government by the people as history has never before witnessed. And so, my friends, with that affirmation of the vitality of democratic government behind us, that demonstration of its resilience and its capacity for decision and for action, with that knowledge of our own strength and power, we move forward with God's help to the greatest epoch of free achievement by free men that the world has ever known.
Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard the President of the United States. He was introduced by Mr. Daniel J. Tobin and spoke from the Statler Hotel in Washington.